If there's one word that you can use to describe Nintendo, it would be litigious. They are a company that vehemently pursues copyright infringements against them. Recently, we heard some very, very good news out of Nintendo that they were getting rid of the Nintendo Creators Program, which allowed me and other people on YouTube and Twitch to be able to stream or post Nintendo content without worrying that they would come after us. I looked at that and I said that that's great. And then, but you also have to look at what else Nintendo's done this year. They've come down on ROM sharing sites like Love ROMs, and sued them for millions and millions of dollars. I think it was $12 million that they sued ROM sites for. And their lawyers have been working overtime. And they are now suing this guy who he's got a whole bunch of NES classics. And it's not because he's scalping them. I can't stand scalpers, but it's not because he's scalping them. The Nintendo's suing him because he modded those NES classics and dumped a bunch of ROMs on there that he obviously doesn't have the rights to. Like hundreds of ROMs of NES games are on these systems, and he is selling them, and Nintendo is going after him for that, which they have to do. I mean, if they don't do that, then it is possible that they could lose their copyright. That's how copyright law works in my non-lawyer understanding, is that if a company has a copyright on something and somebody infringes upon that copyright, and then the company who owns the copyright does not take legal matters to pursue the copyright infringement, then they could lose the copyright. Redneck Matt in chat says it's a very squatters' rights kind of situation. So basically, if I have a copyright on a character, like we'll pretend I'm Nintendo, I have a Mario character and somebody else starts making a Mario game, and if I don't sue them, then I could lose the rights to sue anybody for doing that. So this guy is clearly violating copyright by putting a bunch of pirated ROMs on his system that he is then selling to people. And, you know, there are kind of legal gray areas when it comes to emulation. I kind of come down on the side of it's okay as long as there's no legal way for you to buy the game. And yes, I know you could go to a used game shop and spend hundreds of dollars on a rare cartridge, but it's not like Nintendo actually gets any of that money anyway. So I don't really see that as being a valid argument. However, if Nintendo gives me the option to spend money for things that I like, then clearly I will. I've got here in my hand an NES Classic, not modded, without ROMs on it. I've got a Super Nintendo Classic, again, not modded, without ROMs on it. And if Nintendo were to bring out an N64 Classic, which, if you listen to Reggie Fils-Aimé, it's not in the cards in the future, but if they were to bring out an N64 Classic, I would gladly part with some of my hard-earned cash in order to pick up one of those as well, because I want to support companies that make stuff that I like. However, if I want to play, let's say, I'm trying to think of an old game that, Golgo 13. Let's say I want to play Golgo 13, which is an old NES game. If I want to play that, and there's no way for me to legally buy that, giving the company that made it money, there's no way for me to legally buy it, then I feel like it's okay for me to play a ROM of that. I know that some people would disagree with me there, and that's totally fine. That's why I think it's a legal gray area and a moral gray area. I'm okay with people disagreeing with me on that. I know that there's a lot of people that disagree with me on that. There's also people who think you should just be able to download whatever you want and never have to pay for video games, which I think that those people are just bananas crazy. But that's not really what we're talking about here. We're talking about a guy who has downloaded all these ROMs and then used them to make a profit. which is way outside the realm of a legal gray area or a moral gray area. This is 100% illegal, immoral, and just downright stupid. I can't believe that this guy would think that Nintendo would just let that go. Although, to be fair, and this is a phrase that I never thought I'd say, Soulja Boy, which I think my first year teaching, my students were doing the Soulja Boy Superman dance. Like they would ask if they could like have a little competition on who could do the dance the best. Teenagers, you know. Soulja Boy is selling a retro console for I think it's $150, and it contains a whole bunch of ROMs. I think there's hundreds of games on it, and some of them are Nintendo games from what I heard. So I think that he's probably going to get a C&D from Nintendo as well. He's probably going to get sued by Nintendo. My guess is he has no idea what's happening. He just put his name on something and said, I like video games. I'm going to sell this and make some money off it. Use my brand to try and make some cash. And I don't blame him for doing that, but he should know what he's getting into. And if this guy is getting sued by Nintendo, then I bet you Soulja Boy is getting sued by Nintendo as well. And hopefully that is the last time that I have to say Soulja Boy on this podcast, because that is irritating to say. The reason I'm bringing this up is not because it's a big deal that Nintendo is suing them. This is exactly what they are supposed to do. But in the legal documents, there's this really strange phrase that Nintendo used, and it kind of jumped out at a lot of people. And this is from GoNintendo.com. It says here, Nintendo Switch users can purchase games either digitally from the official Nintendo Switch online shop, formerly the Nintendo eShop, or in physical copies. Let me read that again. Either from the official Nintendo Switch online shop, formerly the Nintendo eShop. So it seems like, and I'm going to, I think that this is, I'm going to say it's a rumor, but it feels like it's probably true that Nintendo is changing the name of the eShop to the Nintendo Switch online shop. Now, why? Why would they do that? I mean, there is a lot of brand recognition with the name eShop, but at the same time, it also feels a little archaic, kind of like when you look at an iPhone. Like that is a holdover from not that this is an archaic device, but the name feels like it is anachronistic. It's out of its time, because this is, the whole whatever came out back when the iMacs were first coming out, and they had those stupid translucent plastic computers that Apple was selling. I mean, it just seems really strange. And eShop kind of feels the same way. It reminds me of eSurance, like those stupid commercials where they were trying to sell me insurance on the internet or something like that. I can't remember exactly how that works. Putting E in front of stuff and putting I in front of stuff, like that is something that was very 1990s, late 1990s, very early 2000s. And perhaps Nintendo is looking at that and they're like, well, it sounds kind of dumb. Maybe we should move away from it, even though there is a lot of brand recognition there. So, formerly the Nintendo eShop, what does that mean? Does it mean that they're just going to change the name, or are we going to see other changes? Because they're suing this guy over ROMs of very old video games. So when in this they say Nintendo Switch users can purchase games either digitally or physical copies, when they say that they can purchase them digitally, that's not talking about a subscription to the Nintendo Switch online service. That is talking about handing over your money and getting your license in return. in a digital fashion. That is very interesting. So does that mean that there's a possibility that when we switch from the eShop over to the Nintendo Switch online shop, does that mean that there's a possibility that we're going to be able to purchase retro video games? I don't know. I've talked about this on the show before. What I'd really like to see myself is basically the NES Classic as a game that I can buy on my Switch. So I could go there, buy the NES Classic, and play the games that are on the NES Classic with the same exact interface that's already on here. I think that would be really cool. Same thing with the Super Nintendo Classic. And that would also mean that Nintendo doesn't have to spend any money manufacturing hardware, especially since they have said that once these run out, they're not making any more. Once the NES Classic is gone, once the Super Nintendo Classic is gone, those two are then sunset, and they're not going to be manufacturing more of them. Of course, they've said that before, but this time I think I'm buying into it. I think that this time they kickstarted the old money printing machines because a lot of people complained that they were really hard to get. They're not hard to get anymore. You can easily go to a store. You can find Super Nintendo Classics and NES Classics on the shelf. Every time I've gone to Best Buy lately, which is the only store in the local mall that I can stomach going into because there's nothing else in the mall that is interesting to me. Best Buy has the stuff that I would be interested in, but every time I go into Best Buy, I always see the NES Classic and Super Nintendo Classic. So I would like to see basically a digital version of our NES and Super Nintendo Classic on the Nintendo Switch. I would also like to see that sold as a physical cartridge that you could get. And then they could also sell the NES Classic 2 as a digital game, or the Super Nintendo Classic as a digital game. And all of the complaints that a lot of people had about the NES Classic and the Super Nintendo Classic was, okay, well, you gave me all these games, but how come I don't have those games on it? Well, maybe that could be in the sequel to the NES Classic and Super Nintendo Classic, at least for me. Redneck says, well, RJS, you're speaking logically, and Nintendo doesn't necessarily follow logic. Yeah, I know Nintendo doesn't always follow logic. There's a lot of things that Nintendo won't do, but for a long time, there's a lot of things that we would assume Nintendo would never do, and they just changed it. I mean, I think I talked about this at the beginning, but the first thing that comes to mind is I never thought Nintendo would allow content creators like myself to be able to make and monetize content using Nintendo's intellectual property. That's crazy to me that that's happened. And at the end of the year, the Nintendo Creators Program is being shuttled, and we are free to do whatever we want. So, well, within reason, as long as we're not being, gross with their IP or anything, because then they'll come after you. But I think that we might be looking at a new Nintendo here. We do have a new president, Mr. Furukawa, who is very young compared to the outgoing Mr. Kimishima and his predecessor, Mr. Iwata. So maybe the introduction of younger leadership at Nintendo is starting to have an effect that a lot of people will be happy about. Who knows? Cross your fingers. I hope that this stuff happens. But it's very interesting that we find out things like this from a court filing. So I don't know who sits there and reads this stuff. It certainly isn't me. But I'm glad that they did, and I'm glad that they noticed this stuff so I can tell you about it. What do you guys think? Let me know.